Hello. This video is going to be a bit different than my uh, usual software videos. I have been recently trying to read some math books that I learned in college, like calculus level and uh, electromagnetism and just like calculus sort of things. And I didn't really get into um, transformations of integrals and Lorentz equations, um, Maxwell's equations. So I was trying to read some of the units that I remember, um, like in electromagnetism, and I recall reading something about CGS units, and how SI units don't use, or how they use something like rationalize. So I wanted to learn more about that. And I always thought that if a number is exact, then it would be like an accurate or a practical use in like physics when you're measuring something small like an ion or a quark. So according to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, it's not really possible to measure ions because they're always in motion, or electrons in an atom. So it's all based on probability, and that's kind of how SI units are. Even when I was studying chemistry in college, I didn't really focus too much on SI units because that's more of an engineering thing. And from my background, this was really a long time ago, so I haven't really been active in the field. But I remember that the the units that you use, um, if you're just measuring one dimension, then it doesn't really matter so much. But if you're measuring like multiple dimensions, then the estimate is really dependent on units. So, so I got into this recently, like, I don't know, a few months ago. I was just trying to find something that I like to study a lot, to study computer circuits and stuff, but I still haven't really gotten around to that. But one of the things that's really cool is Heaviside Lorentz uses a different system where it does use rationalized, but it doesn't use 4 pi because it's sort of like not a real number if it's not really referring to anything that's going to be rationalized. But I kind of understand it. I'm guessing that if a number is irrational, it doesn't really correspond to a real electronic weight. If you're measuring like Avogadro's number of like a certain, non-repeating number that wouldn't technically exist. But anyways, and then also while I was reading about this, there was apparently some guy who wanted to study like the perfect measurement, but then he ended up going with the SI units because I guess the Gauss wasn't really working or something. But and then I just kept reading about this person Heaviside because I guess he was working with Maxwell's equations too. And then I read that he simplified his equation. So I was like, well, I thought it was Maxwell that did it, but apparently he made them like simpler. So he kind of keeps popping up in this whole like century in England, which is kind of interesting. And then one of the sources that quoted Heaviside, in the sources they referred to this book here, maybe not here, but there was this um, electrical engineering professor in 1987 or so, wrote the first edition of this book, 88, and then he also added a second edition in 2002. And it's basically this book, Oliver Heaviside, The Life, Work, and Times of an Electrical Genius in the Victorian Age. And he is Heaviside is obviously not one of the more well-known scientists at the time. You know, there was Maxwell, there was Faraday, who really kind of discovered the whole electricity and magnetism. And then there was, Einstein and Humphrey Davy and all these other figures. So he almost seems like a minor character, but at the same time, there's so many other like luminaries that around this time, like even Einstein, were starting to like eclipse them in terms of like how many large discoveries were. So only relatively, because of all these discoveries, was someone like Heaviside only starting to get noticed like 50 years after, like around 1950. And then even then, one of the notes states that like some of his writings weren't even like fully, I guess, archived, like, or properly archived or something. So a lot of these like things just keep showing up after like many years. So specifically, the 2002 edition of this actually adds a lot of new information. So it's very interesting because even just 22 years ago when he was writing this, he actually updates to the first edition. So I definitely recommend this second edition. And I haven't even read the book yet, but I did read much of the preview a couple weeks ago, and I kind of just got around back to it because there was just a lot of things I wanted to find out. But so basically, of course, he is definitely known as being an eccentric scientist, and he is, I guess, even this American writer calls him sort of an eccentric. By British standard, that's actually considered somewhat not uncommon, or at least they take pride in them, according to this. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I do want to cover a lot of really interesting things. It's like if this was like 20 years ago, like the only place you could actually preview a book in this depth was at a bookstore, so it's kind of like, previewing a book while you're just reading at a Barnes & Noble. But fortunately, you don't have to do that anymore if you just want to read like 20 pages, which is still quite a bit. You can write a short story in that time. So yeah, I mean, it kind of compares him to like Oscar Wilde and Lewis Carroll. And what is interesting though is that even people like Faraday, they didn't have like I mean, there were a lot of mathematicians and scientists who had sort of humble origins. Like with Faraday, he did have very humble origins, but he wasn't like weird in the same way as Heaviside. And so some of the details that emerge from the writings just turn out that he wasn't like really that weird. Even in his old age, he was just probably just enjoying like being weird, like being aware of his weirdness. But anyways, so some of this other stuff about, like, the interesting thing is that even from an early age, he actually lived in the Charles Dickens neighborhood, So that was interesting. And the interesting thing about this book is that a typical historian who isn't in the technical um, level of understanding of his works wouldn't be necessarily able to kind of cover all of that. So it is very um, good that someone with a technical background was able to cover it, but also had enough like writing skills to write in a more well-rounded way to communicate even to a non-technical audience, because you can still read this book even if you don't understand, Maxwell's equations, which I don't, but there's still enough you can kind of infer from this. And they don't really pit him against the like establishment, but early on he did have some sort of um, like he wasn't really influential until he sort of got his papers read by more established people. Like I think Maxwell and Lorentz kind of did read his book or read his papers, so they were able to kind of get him a little bit more notice. Anyways, so moving forward, I'm just gonna skip to the parts that I remember reading that were pretty notable. And so he received lots of correspondence. And yeah, like, so some of this stuff happened after he wrote this book in 88. For example, there was someone who did write a story about one of his neighbors, and that was, let's see here. Well, actually, I don't really understand. I've never learned the operational calculus aspect, but that can be an important thing. Like, it would be interesting to see what is easier to learn. It's possible that his mathematics was slightly less conventional, well, slightly less conventional and organized to teach in a school setting, which might be why they changed to the Laplace transform, but it could just be that it was maybe they just didn't like his methods, and they were just too, I don't know, contradictory or antagonistic, I guess. So one of the interesting things was he had a neighbor, I guess. Let me see here. And some of this stuff isn't that really important, I guess, but it just, yeah, anyways. Let me see here. Yeah, I keep discovering a whole bunch of other things here. I had thought I was reading it on a different chapter, but I must have skipped over to something else. Yeah, so this was the neighbor who apparently was one of his bullies. He tormented him. The So he kind of writes in this like innocent, boyish recollection of his neighbor. Him being sort of like, I don't know, scared of him Heaviside was engaged in a certain intricate researches into the nature of etheric wage. I cannot describe his discoveries, but they must have been of some importance. But I could have told the Times a great many things about Professor Heaviside, which, though they may not have been of interest to the scientist, would have provided a student of eccentric psychology with abundant food for thought. The Times, for instance, did not mention that he seldom dressed and was usually attired with a kimono of pale pink silk, nor did the Times see to fit to mention that Heaviside, in a moment of pique, had caused most of the furniture of his house to be removed, had it replaced by large granite rocks, which stood about in the bare rooms like the furnishings of some Neolithic giant. Through those fantastic rooms he wandered, growing dirtier and dirtier, more and more unkempt, with one exception. His nails were always exquisitely manicured and painted a glistening cherry pink. It is interesting that, like, this is the only source of, that story. I mean, it is definitely possible that it's true, but it's just one of those things that if they had so much animosity and things, they probably could have made up stuff like that. But a lot of people didn't doubt his intelligence, even if he was eccentric. They said that he was just another figure of whom to be afraid. He was surrounded with the childish aura of terror. I used to creep under the bushes and peer through a gap in the wall, watch him prowling about his ragged, thorny garden. Through the unwashed windows I could see the rock standing in his walls of his drawing room. Now and then he would pause, glare in my direction, and he had a habit of suddenly pulling his pink dressing gown very tight and flicking his glistening fingers above his head. Apparently Nichols and his brothers did rather more than just watch Heaviside, because, as he goes on to write, occasionally during the summer months my father would receive a letter from the subject of tennis balls, which I or my brothers had inadvertently knocked into his gardens. His wormship, Professor Oliver Heaviside, presents his compliments to Mr. John Nichols and wormfully requests permission to bring certain matters to his attention. Then came the substance of the complaint. The letters were always signed Oliver Heaviside, Worm. It is an ironic thought that the author of these letters was largely responsible for bringing the radio technique to its present pitch of perfection. Interestingly, Nichols wrote that his father thought Heaviside to be simply a grand joke, but to the young boy he was far more threatening. Nichols ends his remembrance of his scary neighbor with these words. I'm going to use an English accent. To me, as a child, he was a bogey, a witch doctor, another figure to fear in a world in which fear was the guiding force. Never would I venture into his garden to fetch a ball that had been lost. I felt that once inside those walls I should never come out again, or if I did, that I should be changed and have a light of madness in my eye, and should wander down the hill and out in the world, a lost boy whom nobody knew. I learned of Nichols' fate too late for the original edition of this book, but I was able to include an abbreviated summary of his recollections in the Scientific American Essay. So it goes on to go even into a Hollywood screenplay with Orson Welles. Apparently, Norbert Wiener also thought of Oliver Heaviside as some sort of heroic underdog in the whole scientific establishment, and Orson Welles didn't respond or like or just find it interesting enough to make a movie. I guess the um, the first movie that he made, um, Citizen Kane, was kind of like, I guess more movie worthy, but I guess he just didn't have interest in it, or he kind of already did something like it, or who knows. But I guess you could say that, I guess, with AT&T there was this whole commercialization of it. Um, it does get a little more complicated because, if Norbert Wiener wasn't a very good writer, he might not have really seen or known how to turn it into a story where it's kind of like the inventor gets his invention stolen or commercialized. I mean, it probably could be a good. They probably could still make a good movie out of it, but they would have to do like a biopic where they only pick the interesting parts of his life, kind of like with Oppenheimer, but not the same. It doesn't have to be like regarding a specific event. It could just be like that his whole life's eccentric and all that. But anyways, so yeah, and then it kind of goes into. It actually suggests or speculates that Norbert Wiener had an issue with I don't know, one of the other scientists. But what's yeah, I mean, there's so many sections here. Why it's interesting to read about him because yeah, why is he the author? Why is it an odd question that he would even be asking his readers? So he's very reflective on the whole aspect of writing this book. And this was in 1988, I presume. Yeah, preface to the original edition. So it isn't because historians of science are unappreciative of Oliver Heaviside. In the biographies of other scientists, Heaviside's name appears over and over again. Yet this is the first major treatment of his life and work. Perhaps it is, as William Bergson wrote in his admirable Fields of Force, because the bulk of his work is extremely technical and difficult, it is unlikely that a full scientific and personal biography of him will be written. 1974. To unravel that technical difficulty was, indeed, no easy task. In our modern times, in which nearly everything has to be packaged for the person to go, including Reader's Digest essays, and even some so-called books that can be consumed during the brief time one allows for washing down a hamburger with a soft drink, who is going to take the time to plow through Heaviside? There are mere paragraphs in his papers that can take literally hours to figure out. And the decipherment isn't just the reading of cramped handwriting. Heaviside's work is full of monstrously long and involved mathematics, enough to give even the technically trained a headache. It is no wonder that for a historian trained to pursue literary and social threads through the fabric of his subject's life, the sight of all that intricate math and physics is more than sufficient to create a tidal wave of despair. To hell with Heaviside, they might think, and turn their scholarly attention to Lincoln, Hitler, Faraday, or even Einstein. Lytton Strachey wrote in Eminent Victorians, his biographical masterpiece that debunked the values of the well-to-do classes of Heaviside's 19th century England, that it is perhaps as difficult to write a good life as to live one. He was right. And so it goes on to talk about writing the book, and so perhaps I was the first person foolhardy enough to do Heaviside. And this is interesting too, that one could make a good story out of the life of an author without saying much about his works. By regarding authors solely as colorful human beings who led eventful lives, popularized literary biographies, appealed to countless readers who had little interest in literature as such and were not especially eager to acquire any knowledge of it. For every reader of a vividly written biography of Byron who went on to sample Don Juan, there were thousands who were content to have enjoyed a guided tour through his love life. And to a much lesser extent, the same misrepresentation has been committed in scientific biographies. Tesla and Einstein are examples, but not in this book. Heaviside certainly was a colorful character, even a mysterious one, and I have tried to get the flavor of those aspects of his life into the pages that follow, but it is his work that is of primary concern here. And that's the problem, of course. His work is so damn much work to figure out. But no matter, it has been a labor of love, etc. So one question I am often asked by those who hear I have been working on his book, Heaviside, what did he do? My own children are even more direct. Why not write a book, they ask, that will make a lot of money like that one trashy horror novels? Okay. I started this book as an uncritical admirer of Heaviside. He was literally quite my hero, and why not? Who came out of nowhere and took on the pompous know-it-all government. As I learned more, old Ali started to show his spots. I still admire Heaviside. He did the very best he could. I'm not so sure I would have liked Oliver, but maybe not. This is not ever said a revisionist. This is not a revisionist biography. He is not revealed to have been secretly Jack the Ripper or to have been a collector of. Yep. And I don't want compliments. I just facts and justice. I have tried to enter that request, and certainly true. Offend the truly academic, but I see no intellectual merit in striving for the dry and ponderous tone for its own sake. There is already plenty of that sort of stuff in the journal literature. The historian as detective. In history, perhaps more than in any other discipline, the book is the man. That is certainly true in the case of this book, and my authorship is reflected by a marked tendency to insert chatty first-person commentary. So, one of the things I read earlier when I reviewed this a couple of weeks ago is that Heaviside also liked to insert his comments in even academic papers. So he would sort of write sort of like jokes, or he would make comments about people in his papers, and that was kind of funny. And so it is good that there's more scientific history that kind of covers the context, because a lot of history that is viewed today is kind of viewed from today's perspective, and a lot of the events that happened back then may not have made a lot of sense. And let me see if I don't really recall reading all this. I only probably read a few parts of the preview. There's quite a few pages here. How much easier it must have been for those writers to ramble on about Tesla's crazy talk of rings around the Earth. Yeah, so something more subtle with just equations and Heaviside is a lot harder to sell as a book when you're trying to compete against someone who's writing a book like H.G. Wells, or something that's more simplified in terms of science or science fiction, like, rays or space travel and that sort of thing. Like, these are just electrical things that don't really have any apparent um, spectacle for the reader. So it's kind of like a nerd's nerd sort of biography. And I'll just skip over to a few other sections here. So this is the introduction. To the majority of people, the unusual and arresting name of Oliver Heaviside conveys nothing. There's actually an SNL joke that's about this, like, New York accountant that's kind of similar to that. I forget his name, but I read about it like a week ago. And Heaviside's life was in some respects a great tragedy, but he emerges from it a man of tremendous intellectual stature. Heaviside's whole life can be read as a kind of allegory on the ultimate triumph of virtue. So, who was Oliver Heaviside? That question has many answers, so let me give you a few of them straight away. He was a man born in mid-Victorian times at a low social and economic level, who, with no formal education after the age of 16, eventually came to be accepted as the intellectual equal of the finest scientific minds of the day. He was a man who lived as a recluse among his relatives, having resigned from his one and only job at age 24. He then devoted the next 35 years of his life to first-rate scholarly research. The publication of technical papers of astonishing achievement, and the carrying on of some of the most interesting correspondence this side of the secret love letters, if only they had ever been written. And he was a man who was incapable of conducting himself properly in the most elementary social interaction. Meeting a local townsperson while on a walk around the grounds of his home inevitably led to a note in his diary about what nasty business he had just endured. As far as is known, his only continuing contacts with women were limited to his mother, nieces, and housekeepers. He was a man who knew the power of money and desired it but refused to work for it, preferring to live off the sweat of his family and long-suffering friends, whom he often insulted even as they paid his bills. In short, Oliver Heaviside was a highly complex man with some rather rough edges. He was often an uncivil, insensitive, boorish individual, but he was much more, too. He was a mathematical physicist of the first rank, an electrical engineer with amazing powers of analytic and physical insight, and an accomplished artist at the game of literary invective never before since equaled in the scientific literature. He could also be an extremely funny fellow in print and didn't hesitate, even in the midst of a swirl of equations, to insert an hilarious jab at some individual who had displeased him. In one of his copies of Nature, in the margin next to the printed observation, the virtues of science are exactness, impartiality, candor. Heaviside wrote, "Candor should come first. Clearly, then this is a man worth learning about." There is a strange paradox involved in trying to understand what it was Oliver Heaviside did. To understand Einstein's special theory of relativity, for example, one needs mathematics no more advanced than algebra. To truly delve into Heaviside's major work, however, requires a bit more, indeed some fairly heavy mathematical artillery. The paradox in this is that Einstein's theory applies almost everywhere in the universe. One notable exception is the inside of a black hole where nobody knows what happens, while Heaviside's efforts are mostly applicable to the much more restrictive situations inside an electric cable. It seems superficially that more mathematics is required to understand the details of a telephone circuit than to comprehend the most intimate secrets of Mother Nature. Another part of the paradox is that no matter how much theoretical physicists may grumble about it, Oliver Heaviside's work on how to make a decent telephone cable plays a vastly greater role in our everyday lives than Einstein's work. Knowledge of the equation behind the bomb, E equals mc squared, is not essential for its making. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have been doomed had Einstein never lived. Heaviside, to be sure, is not to be placed in the same class of intellect as Maxwell and Einstein, who, with Newton by those who like to make rankings, are considered the supreme physicists of all time. But with this example, we see Heaviside operating at a very high level indeed. Okay. When Heaviside was born, for example, it was a time when even the upper classes rarely had a water closet in their homes, and the privy reigned supreme. Followed not too closely, one can hope, by the open hole over cesspit, and the wet midden Holder dubious honor. Well, I might skip over that. There were some other interesting things I remember reading. The industrial landscape of Wolverhampton, Staffordshire. So the conditions that he grew up in were yeah, I guess I should cover this part. I thought it was further back, but I must have missed this part here. I do remember that he did grow up in a very rundown neighborhood of London near where Charles Dickens wrote, and I think he quoted Heaviside in one of his writings, and Heaviside quoted Dickens more often, but they live like just around the corner. So Heaviside remained true all his adult life to the disinterest and steady employment for regular wages. This would cause too much friction. Life in the cities was no better, could be extremely dangerous places. Typhus, smallpox, diphtheria, and typhoid were common. East London swept by Asiatic cholera epidemic as late as 1866 to 67. The source of all this misery was a lack of sanitation that we would today consider criminal. The rivers and canals were used as public sewage pipes. Into them were continually dumped rocks, dead animals, and discarded bones and blood from slaughterhouses. It was not a rare sight to see birds walking on the surface of stream, so thick was their pollution. In the summer of 1858, for example, the always terrible smell of Thames reached such depths as to drive the MP of the House of Commons from their deliberations. Charles Dickens bluntly called the river an open sewer, and Michael Faraday echoed him by calling it a fermenting sewer. One can speculate that if London was literally hell on earth, as that merry old town was often described in those awful times, then the Thames would surely have been an excellent choice for the Styx, which is the Greek river of the underworld. So there was a comic with the satirical newspaper cartoon Punch magazine was inspired by a letter Faraday wrote to London Times, the cartoon which the magazine wrote, because we are losing brave men by war, it is rather more desirable than otherwise that we should not also lose useful citizens by pestilence. As we certainly shall if the Thames continues much longer to be an open sewer. We hope that Professor Faraday's publication will effect a saving of human life, still greater than which has resulted from his predecessor's Sir Humphrey Davy's safety lamp, which I presume is the lamp that replaced the kerosene or gas lamp in the coal mines. And Trinity by the Master. Father Thames. Father Thames, it's like the river. Okay. That's actually... Oh, I thought that was another architect. So there were all these factories, there was coal, there was all that. Okay, I must have skipped parts. Well, there's probably more. Wildly eccentric, difficult, and... So this is where he grew up. This was his house, and it says, with the exception of the portico, it bears an astonishing resemblance to Charles Dickens' house on Bayham Street, which was also the residence of Wilkins. Heaviside occasionally referred to Dickens's characters in his writings, and in an interesting coincidence, Dickens once inadvertently but all too appropriately returned the favor. A man with an odd sense of humans. Dickens had an ersatz book bound for his home library reading bearing the title Heaviside's Conversations with Nobody. He lived in a gloomy, dangerous dungeon on King Street until he was 13, and a miserable 13 years they must have been to cause him to later declare that they had permanently deformed his future life. It displays a portico that seems oddly out of place, hinting at a grandeur that is nowhere to be seen. A considerable amount of poverty exists. And there's some also really funny or interesting stories. When he went to school, so he was frequently ill. He often required the aid of his brothers, who were also engravers. So often, in fact, did the family's finances drift near the edge of disaster that Oliver's mother, Rachel, decided to open a private school for girls. Before her marriage, she worked as a governess. One of the former students may well have been William Spottiswoode, in whose family served she had been employed, who later became a president of the Royal Society. And she believed her experience could be turned into badly needed money. It was at his mother's school, starting in 1855, that Oliver received his first formal instruction. So he was technically homeschooled, but at an actual school run by his mother. He initially rebelled at being the lone boy in the midst of giggling girls, but after his father showed him the alternative by dragging him across the street to the regular neighborhood school, populated by a large number of young Camden Town roughnecks, he dropped his objections. In 1858, his mother placed him in the High Street School, St. Pancras, which provided education for boys of the intermediate classes. And they ended up renting out the home, which also brought in some money. And interestingly, he ended up having a school principal at his later school. And his principal teacher was also sort of like, Oliver found worthy of respect. Oliver was a good student, but never took anything as true merely because it came from an authority. In some ways, he must have been a pain in the neck for Mr. Cheshire, particularly so when the class took up lessons in geometry. And it goes on to say, he would complain. So he did really well in the natural sciences except for geometry. And it wasn't limited to just that. Obviously, I can see that he doesn't appreciate grammar, but I wouldn't even agree with it, of course, since he doesn't understand grammar very well. So yeah, he says some things like a sad lad, a bad lad, where is the improvement? Well, I guess words can make a difference. I'm trying to find, there was a part where the principal took him across the street to the same school. I guess just like the mom did. Let me see here. And so he was working at the telegraph company, where he was just kind of working in an office. It wasn't a very big telecom company like it is today, but referring to any ISP today, not a telephone company or telegraph. So he worked at the Danish telegraph outpost, and then he returned. This is also interesting. So the author speculates why he didn't go to university work, even though his family, or he believes his family would have tolerated that he would get, an extra degree. And it says, a lack of money certainly isn't the answer, since if they were willing to support him, then he wouldn't have objected to him attending classes. They might have welcomed that as a respectable alternative compared to what they actually put up with. It is all speculation today as to what really motivated him. He believes that the answer might be quite unmysterious and direct. He may have simply concluded, in his pragmatic and stubborn way, that there just wasn't anything for him to learn at a university. Heaviside's background and interest in the early 1870s were those of a practical engineer, and as one writer put it at the turn of the century, it was not so very long ago that engineers became willing to recognize that technical training had an academic side at all. And electrical engineering was a shirt-sleeve working man's job in those days, one sharply distinct from the atmosphere of scientific training provided by a university. As one ditty of the day put it, some talk of millimeters and some talk of kilograms, and some of deciliters to measure beer and drams. But I'm a British workman, too old to go to school, so by pounds I'll eat, and by quarts I'll drink, and I'll work my 3-foot mule. But suppose Heaviside had decided to attend a university, say Cambridge. There would have been the issue of having to take an oath on graduation, swearing to be a practicing member of the Church of England, and this, I believe, Oliver, not being much of a God-fearing man, would have refused to do. But suppose we ignore that. I don't believe he would have lasted very long. Certainly he would have rebelled at educational philosophy of that institution's academic star, Isaac Todhunter, who wrote, concerning his attitude towards a student who would dare to put his faith in actual experiments and not just have blind faith in his teacher. If he does not believe the statements of his tutor, perhaps a clergyman of mature knowledge, recognized ability, and blameless character, his suspicion is irrational, and manifests a want of the powers of appreciating evidence, a want fatal to his success in that branch of science which he is supposed to be cultivating. Heaviside, a man who energetically took on eminent representatives of the British Empire's electrical establishment, would no doubt have done something unforgivable if told this to his face in a professor's classroom. It was probably best for Heaviside, for his potential professors, and most certainly for the independent spirit in Heaviside's paper, that he didn't go to Cambridge. It is clear that after he left his job, there was never any question in his mind about what he would do next. What he did was to attain, through unguided self-study, a mastery of the treatise second to none, and then to devote almost all the remainder of his life seeking out the implications hidden away in Maxwell's theory of the electromagnetic field. And interestingly, this is one of those historical differences that aren't really recognized. But I mean, with universities having so many departments today, something like engineering was considered like a working profession, and it wasn't even considered academic until then. And he even, makes a lot of jokes towards the writings of, in his writings, he also makes some crass jokes. Let me see if I can find one example here. And he was also like rude to his telegraph co-workers. He wouldn't want to be the bookbinder. He would only want to do like the electrical work here. But what is remarkable is that he discovered the ionic gas layer of the atmosphere. I think it was the ionosphere, one of the things, which is responsible for the shortwave skip propagation. And so a lot of that stuff ended up improving the transmission or the speed of the telegraph. Him being one of the few telegraph providers. And I could imagine that having worked at this telegraph company for even for a short while must have been kind of boring. So he was really just working on just really boring technical things. But in in retrospect, it's definitely influential, but it still doesn't cover like those large general theories that generalists like Einstein and even Maxwell are typically known for. So there were definitely some interesting parts about his education, and I think it would even kind of correlate with some of his later life, where I don't know, I don't think just because he was seated with the girls' school that he was wearing like pink nail polish or something when he was really old. I don't know if there was any relation with that. I don't think just being in a school with um, being the only boy in that school had any influence on that. But he he did have some other. I mean, I'm not going to analyze the personality so much, but he did have a lot of like when he was studying, he would keep all the windows closed, even if it was really hot. I guess he worked in like really hot weather. Um, oh yeah, so this is where it mentions he had little to say about the personal aspects of life, except for occasional remarks scattered about in letters and in research notebooks, which now and then served double duty as his diary. He did once allude to a proposed autobiography. When I start this work, volume 3 of electromagnetic theory, I have the idea of 4 volumes. Circumstance prevented this. Wicked people I have known. Oh, this was another funny thing. So, in the teaching of mathematics, 1900, in an essay on the same subject prepared a year later for a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, often called the BA, which in turn Oliver would unkindly reinterpret as the British asses, as did Maxwell before him. Heaviside was even more to the point. Boys are usually exceedingly stupid in anything requiring concentrated reasoning. It is not in the nature of their soft brains that they should take kindly to Euclid and other stuff of that logic chopping kind. So Wheatstone was a prestigious member of the scientific society, and he was he was the uncle of Heaviside. So he did kind of help Heaviside become a little more um, involved in that scientific community, but only to a certain extent. And Heaviside would also reject certain things, like that pension, until he eventually got accepted that. And yeah, there may have been some other interesting things that I recall reading, but it does look like he was very busy with math and physical writings, but he he mainly wrote in his parents' like spare bedroom, so he wasn't really working most of his life. I guess he sort of earned like an income later on, but he wasn't really um, yeah, like he wouldn't have been able to do it without his other support, but he also wasn't really capable of um, earning that kind of salary on his own, unless he was employed by the university or working with the telegraph company. But even then, I suppose it was better that he had time to write papers and stuff. I don't know how much his siblings and family, had to sacrifice to support him, but he still seemed to, made a lot of contributions. But that part about just being sort of like, I think there was another thing that he wrote um, in one of the essays, and I think his editor omitted something that he wrote. From another account, we learned that he was a short, red-headed Englishman of autocratic disposition and of superb powers of mental penetration and intuition. He was not just a landlocked telegraph operator. He spent days waiting for Caroline, and he wrote a letter to the parents of William Gordon Brown, a promising young theoretician who had been killed in France, and they had sent Heaviside a copy of their son's paper. In his reply, Heaviside wrote, "For a youth of 20, he was surprisingly advanced. Why, at his age, I didn't know anything at all of analysis nor about electricity." So I guess it was sort of like a letter of condolence that he wrote to the parents, sort of saying that they were that the son who died was actually talented. So that was nice. Um, So he even solved some really complicated faults, which were for the telephone company, or the telegraph company, was very, um, I guess it helped improve the number of telegraphs or speed. And so that window, that home that had very few windows, was actually based on an economic um, reason. So in 1851, before 1851, every window in a dwelling was subject to taxation. So basically, the more windows you build in a house, the more you have to pay taxes on them, which is kind of bonkers, but apparently that was a disincentive for poor houses to have windows, so they basically had very few windows or no windows. And he had corresponded with an Irish physicist. And the complaint was motivated by Heaviside's irritation at having to read Lorentz in the original German, which, despite his grumbling, he could. So I guess he had an appreciation for foreign languages, um, and I guess he even thought that British couldn't even read in foreign languages, but I think it's yeah, that's just probably a stereotype rather than necessarily an incapability. Hmm. So some books were poisons. So I guess he liked the scientific books because he could understand them a little bit better, or he liked the reasoning of it. Books bearing stupendous names such as Newton, Laplace, and so on attracted his attention. And that person that he wrote to his parents, or who died in Paris in 1916, was also similar to another person who died. And I guess he was sort of recommending that person not be a soldier because he thought he was more qualified to be a scientist or a technician. Oh, yeah, this is the part that I was looking for. So apparently that when he was not an active, when he was never in the society, he did keep up with technical literature, where he sort of, in his typical fashion, would comment on unrelated matters. He wrote to the electrician in 1886, around middle age or so. The letter begins with observations on a topic dear to Heaviside, the art of technical nomenclature. It quickly detours wildly. The technical portion is printed in EP2, but the following words were cut from the book for reasons I think obvious. I may perhaps also be allowed to mention, whilst on the subject of nomenclature, a difficulty thrown in the way of learning by the STE and the Society of Telegraph Engineers and Electricians. Some time ago they had trouble with its own nomenclature. Having changed the name 3 times, it may be the Society of the Variable Nomenclature and Redundant Conjunction. I should like it to have simply been called the Electrical Society, following the example of so many other societies who are so satisfied with simple and comprehensive names. And he goes on. So this is all part of the quote. For instance, Physical Society does not call itself the Society of Physicists and Natural Philosophers, nor does the Mathematical Society call itself the Society of Mathematicians and Arithmeticians and Geometricians. But that is not the point to which I would refer, which is that the STE and E has its journals sewed and wired in such a manner that a real difficulty is placed in the way of getting at their contents. They won't lie open, for one thing, which has been called the unpardonable sin of a book. They must therefore be held open. More than that, they must be strongly stretched before the words nearest the wires become readable. They are nearly hidden by every region of curvature. It is as exasperating as a tight boot. So his criticism, I guess these books were like spiral bound in a way, where they kind of had like a spring that kept them closed. I don't think I encountered a book like that, but I can imagine it's probably like a binder, kind of like that thing in a binder that keeps the books bound. So apparently he became a member of the Society of Telegraph Engineers, and he wrote, I got into it nearly 50 years ago and had trouble with it all along. I was then a scientific enthusiast filled with a strong sense of duty to impart my knowledge to others and help them, but I found them very stupid usually. They wouldn't come out of their old grooves. AWH, his brother Arthur, the W stood for West, their mother's maiden name, said I should join the new society. But there were snobs in those days. There are not so many now, I think. On inquiry, he, Arthur, was told they didn't want telegraph clerks. What would Edison say to that, if he were here now? I was riled, so I went to Professor W. Thomson, William Thomson, at that time president of the STE, and asked him to propose me. He was a real gentleman, and agreed at once. So I got in spite of the snobs. Obviously, and that's the end of the quote, obviously Heaviside had no lack of nerve in his youth. Approaching a famous scientist like Sir William Thomson, the professor had been knighted in 1866 to intervene in his behalf. It didn't hurt, of course, that Thomson knew Oliver's uncle, Sir Charles Wheatstone quite well. They had, for example, served together on a consulting committee to the Atlantic Telegraph Company prior to the laying of the 1865 Atlantic cable. In any case, by 1885, Heaviside had fallen so far behind on his dues that he was dropped from the membership list. In 1908, however, by which time the STE had evolved into the IEE, he was elected an honorary member in recognition of his then appreciated accomplishments. Yeah, so he, I guess he sort of earned his way back into fame just by writing a lot of papers, and eventually some physicists, mathematicians recognized some of his work, well, at least some of his work, and a lot of the other papers that he wrote in his parents' spare bedroom. And apparently, the author writes that he still believes that the claim to the contrary of him not wanting to go to Cambridge is likely due to a comment that he made. He would be very sarcastic at Cambridge mathematicians. Why he felt this way we'll see in chapter 10, which I don't have access to. He labeled the work of some of them distressing and soul-destroying, and accused them of being unfair. His particular phrasing is interesting, however, telling us that I believe in his own assessment of his early youth. I regret exceedingly not to have had a Cambridge education myself, instead wasting several years of my life in mere drudgery or more. So it does kind of explain his I guess his antagonism, or not cynicism, but just unhappiness, I guess, with not having a comfortable upbringing. It definitely probably influenced his motivation to kind of, reach to the level of success as people like Maxwell and Lorentz and Faraday, but probably not really caring too much about his status amongst them. So he probably didn't really care too much about, the title of being, a member of such and such society, especially if he didn't even pay the membership dues. So he got expelled there. And actually, this kind of reminded me a little bit of the movie Rushmore, because Bill Murray's character he's he works at this like steel factory, or like they make some it's like this factory, and he kind of had like this working class upbringing, and there's this funny scene in the movie where he basically gives a speech at this private preparatory school, and this is all, of course, being funny, but let me put this on here.
You guys have it real easy. I never had it like this where I grew up. But I send my kids here because the fact is, you go to one of the best schools in the country, Rushmore. Now, for some of you, it doesn't matter. You were born rich and you're going to stay rich. But here's my advice to the rest of you. Take dead aim on the rich boys. Get them in the crosshairs and take them down. Just remember, they can buy anything, but they can't buy backbone. Don't let them forget that. Thank you.
Now, obviously, Max Fisher is not a very good student, and he has his own,
Wes,
he has his own, like,
You guys have it
issues.
real easy.
But, but I think Oliver Heaviside is, definitely someone who, as if you're a historian or even just studying engineering or physics, is someone that you may want to study more about because um, the whole history of electromagnetism and um, computer circuits where it wasn't built by just a handful of engineers. For example, Seymour Cray also had some eccentric things. Like um, he was sort of reclusive in a way, but um, you know, he would, I guess, whenever he was out of ideas, um, or I don't know, he was working on computer design, he would be built, digging a tunnel under his house, and he was looking for elves. I guess the elves would have solutions. I don't know if he was just being funny or just being cryptic. I mean, it's possible that he was just trying to protect his secrets, and he probably didn't want too many people to think much of him if he had something secretive he was doing. But so he definitely had a kind side. I'm guessing, kind of like Heaviside. I don't think even though he was weird, he wasn't necessarily a bad person. Like with Heaviside, he wrote, that nice letter to the parents of that person who died in Paris in 1916. So he seemed to have sort of, I guess, an ethic or so. Well, I don't really have any more to write about. I would like to learn more physics and engineering for my own projects, but yeah, that can be quite of a detour if you're trying to learn, Maxwell's equations, and then you realize that someone made it a lot simpler in translating the equations from, I guess, four short equations from the original. So the original history and then I guess Heaviside had similar things to what Gibbs had. So they both had equations, but they used different notations. Like he used vectors, and then there was another. Wow. So these are the 8 original equations. Can be written in the modern form of Heaviside's vector notation as follows. Well, I guess that might be the original. Well, anyways, thanks for watching.